Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Women in Research Ireland event today, a new vision for Trinity College Dublin, a Q&A with the Trinity Provost Candidates. I am Amy Metcalf, a committee member with Women in Research Ireland, or WIRI for short. I am joined by co-director and co-founder of WIRI, Dr. Susan Feddix, and co-director Dr. Joanne Kenny.
Hi.
Today we have a very special and important event and are thrilled to be hosting Professor Linda Doyle, Professor Jane Olmeyer, and Professor Linda Hogan, the three candidates for the position of Provost at Trinity College Dublin. This will be the first time in Trinity's 429-year history that a woman will hold the position of Provost at Trinity. Professor Linda Doyle is the Vice President for Research / the Dean of Research in Trinity College Dublin and has been in this role since January 2018. She is Professor of Engineering and Arts. Professor Doyle was the founder, director of the SFI Research Centre CONNECT, and she has always taken a strong role in promoting women in engineering and computer science. Professor Jade Olmeyer is the Erasmus Smith's Professor of Modern History at Trinity College Dublin and Chair of the Irish Research Council. Over the past 2 decades, she has served the Trinity community as teacher, scholar, supervisor, mentor, head of department, head of school, founding vice president for global relations, and director at the Trinity Long Room Hub. Professor Linda Hogan holds the Chair of Ecumenics at Trinity College Dublin and is a Fellow of the College. An ethicist and ecumenist, she has published extensively and taught widely on themes in ethics and religion. Between 2011 and 2016, she served as Vice Provost, Chief Academic Officer, and Deputy President for Trinity College Dublin, and is only the third woman to hold this position in the college's 429-year history. For the event, each provost candidate will have 6 minutes to address the meeting. The running order, which was chosen randomly, will be Professor Linda Doyle, followed by Professor Jade Olmeyer and Professor Linda Hogan. Please make use of the Q&A function for your questions or comments. And when posting on social media about the event, please use the hashtags #ChooseToChallenge, #IWD2021, and #WearyNewVision. And with that, I will hand over to Professor Linda Doyle, who will have 6 minutes to address the audience.
Thanks, Amy. And just one quick thing, I'm actually not the Dean of Research at the moment. You're not, you can't be during this process, just to clear that up. So thank you. So everybody, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Really appreciate the invite. And it's great to share this platform with my 2 friends and colleagues, and both are just remarkable women. It's a great honor to be running for Provost, and no matter what happens on April 10th, we can be sure of one thing, that Trinity will have its first woman Provost, and perhaps George Salmon will be rolling in his grave forevermore. My manifesto is called Imagine Trinity, and I call it that because it's an invitation to all to imagine the future we want and to take action to realize that future. And it is a recognition that we can be so much more. And when I say that, I acknowledge all that we have achieved, but I strongly believe that if we truly unleash all the talent in the university, we would be so much more. 2 themes that run through Imagine Trinity that will be of particular interest to you are power and fairness. As you state yourself on your website, your mission is to build a community where silent voices are heard in academic spaces. What a fantastic mission for Women in Research Ireland. This really goes to the heart, for me, of the power question. The Academy has always been structured to listen to some voices more than others. And changing that has always been a part of my life. Power ultimately is about including and excluding. We include and exclude through who is allowed to make decisions, through how and what information is shared, through the language we use, who we choose to celebrate and draw attention to, and much more. The second theme I mentioned is fairness. And Imagine Trinity is about a deep-rooted fairness. Oftentimes in academia, people will say a fair system is the opposite to an excellent system. I completely disagree with this view. To me, a fair system is a system that is about excellence. It is about equal access and opportunity, allowing talent to flourish. It is about nurturing greatness. I see the great hypocrisy at play in the traditional academic system. Much of the research the Academy does is about building a fairer world, with lots of our research focused on climate justice, social justice, equality, and diversity. We need to live the fairness we strive to promote in our work. We need to walk the walk. Many of the concrete actions in Imagine Trinity relate to the workings of Trinity and how power is rebalanced and fairness is built. So I'll not go into these here as we have a wide audience. But I do want to say a few more things about power and fairness in relation to women in Research Ireland more broadly. As you heard already, I was Dean of Research for almost 3 years in Trinity, so I really understand the research landscape. During that time, we saw how funding agencies adapted practices to be more inclusive, in how research awards are constructed, who can apply, how these awards are more fairly evaluated, and how Athena Swan principles came to the fore, and more. More broadly, across the research environment, driven in a big way by European initiatives, gender impact statements have moved from simply stating the number of men and women involved as research participants to a much deeper place, and how the actual research itself may have different implications for different sexes. International initiatives such as DORA, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, move us away from defining research impact narrowly through counting numbers of publications and using journal impact factors as proxies for excellence. And instead, DORA promotes focusing on the intrinsic value and impact of the work itself. On top of this, research integrity efforts push back against bad and exclusionary practices around publications. Our work with LIRU has brought us into contact with best practice in the research integrity world. For example, first authorship principles can make a huge difference to people's careers. And I'm sure Rosalind Franklin, for example, would have much agreed with this. However, there's a very long way to go yet. And much of what I've just mentioned is not embedded enough, nor has full acceptance within the Academy. And we are also critically aware of how the pandemic has impacted women and those in caring roles disproportionately, which will last for years to come. In fact, one of the big challenges going forward will be to remember this, as the effects will be non-linear and long-term. There is also a long way to go yet, because so much more in the Academy needs to be challenged. I really feel we need a revolution in academic culture. Let me just give one example. I have a big interest in open science, or open scholarship, as we call it in Trinity. Most people engage in this topic at the open access level only, but it goes much deeper. I'm on the board of Open Research Europe, a free platform for publishing research funded by EU frameworks. The interesting and challenging piece is that reviews are all open. This means you will see who reviews and what diverse backgrounds are not the reviewers come from. This kind of hugely transparent approach leaves no room for clubs of insiders and exposes biases for what they are. For many, it's scary because it goes against a lot of what we know. And this is what I mean when I say there's lots to discuss and lots to still challenge. In summing up, I'd say there's much to be excited about and to look forward to, but there is much more that needs to be done. I want to lead that change and to do it with others. Groups such as Women in Research in Ireland are playing a great role, and together we can imagine a better future for the Academy and build a community where silenced voices are now heard in academic spaces. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Linda Doyle. And now we're going to move on to Professor Jane Allmeyer.
Thank you very much, Joanne, Amy, Susan, the committee. And again, it's lovely to share the platform with with you and with my two amazing colleagues. So it's great to be here. Thank you. I have published my manifesto, and if you want, the tagline for my campaign is Empowering Trinity. But rather than go through the manifesto, which is obviously available publicly, I want to just approach this from three perspectives. A very personal one, and then my experiences as a university leader, and then my experiences as chair of the Irish Research Council. And just say a few things under each of those. But I am a historian, the professor of modern history, and I see myself very much as a frontline researcher. I'm very actively engaged in research. I hold two big European grants. I have just published recently another book. I mentor and supervise students. And I absolutely remember what it was like to be a PhD student. I studied at Trinity, and then as a mother with two young children, negotiating research, teaching, and just raising a family. I remember falling pregnant with my first son, and I was still doing my PhD at Trinity, and my supervisor was an amazing man called Aidan Clark. And I went into Aidan and I burst into tears. I said, oh my goodness, I haven't finished my thesis and I'm going to have a baby. And I was so overwhelmed by that. And what Aidan said, Jane, that's fantastic news. And it just put everything into perspective, and the importance of actually being a mother and a researcher. And obviously it's very challenging. And then as my kids started to grow up, I was living in the United States at that point, and my marriage broke down. So I had to, I didn't want to stay in the US. I wanted to bring my children up, if you want, on this side of the Atlantic. And I then was looking for other jobs, and I then went to Aberdeen. And the reason I went to Aberdeen was not because it was a good university, it was because of the quality of its childcare provision. It had an absolutely outstanding nursery, and as a single parent, that was utterly essential for me, because of course, without that support network, the quality of childcare provision means everything. And I went on to become chair of the board of the nursery, and that's probably one of the proudest moments, because I wanted to pay back the enormous debt of gratitude I had to the Rocking Horse. So again, for me, this journey is one that I feel very, very committed to supporting women, all women, but especially those of us that are negotiating the challenges of rearing children at the same time. I've been helped enormously by powerful mentors. I mentioned Aidan Clark, but also two other amazing women actually who died along with Aidan in the autumn. And I miss them already, because this is the other thing I've learned as a university leader, is the power and the importance of mentorship. And I want to say a few words about just what I feel I have done and contributed as a university leader. First thing is, I've had a lot of firsts. So I was the first female head of department and school in Aberdeen. I came to Trinity as the first Erasmus Smith Professor of Modern History. And I remember the day vividly, because I came into the history department and the old junior dean, a man called R.B. McDowell, was still around, and R.B. saw me moving into the professor's office, and he just couldn't get his head around it. And he said, why is the new secretary in the professor's office? If something had gone terribly wrong in Trinity. That was back in 2003. And I say it in jest, but the truth is that it has been a challenge in Trinity to address the conservatism and the hierarchy, and in pockets, the misogyny. And I've seen that throughout my career. And I hope I have always been there to support, mentor, and ensure that our female researchers and our female colleagues have had the support that they need, and not just within Trinity, but the work I do with gender in the context of my democracy work through the Crisis of Democracy project, being extremely attuned to the very important role women play around the world. and would have worked with early career researchers, particularly in India and Brazil in this space. And it brings me, of course, to the other thing I've done in Trinity that I absolutely loved, was in the Trinity Long Room Hub working with early career researchers. Again, many of them women, and being able to be there to mentor and support. I think it's very important. I want to just conclude my remarks by saying a few words about what I've done in the context of the Irish Research Council. I'm hugely proud of how the IRC has been at the absolute forefront of leading policies and initiatives around gender. We had the first gender strategy of any research agency in 2015. It was later, or something very similar, was later adopted by SFI HRB, the first agency to bring in gender blind assessment for our Government of Ireland awards. And on the foot of that, the proportion of successful female applicants in AHSS increased by 20%. It was nearly a third in the STEM areas. That's telling me there was bias. I just hope it was unconscious. The IRC now are moving much more into the equality, inclusion and diversity space. In other words, taking the gender strategy and developing it much more broadly. We're about to launch a bullying and harassment policy as well. And I'm very proud of that and the way the other agencies have adopted. We also then threw our weight in behind the HEA gender review and led the initiative for the agencies, the funding agencies, to really insist that universities have Athena Swan Silver by 2022. I think this is hugely important that we have these national policies and this national infrastructure in place, because it goes back, and I'll finish here and saying in terms of the future, Trinity has come a long way, as have many of the other Irish universities. But the truth is that we have a long, long way to go. I'm almost embarrassed that we're the last country in the European Union that will have, if you want, I realise Kirsten May is in Limerick, but you know, Kirsten is there in a caretaker role. So the role in Trinity is, if you want, a full-blown president's role, provost role, vice-chancellor role, whatever you want. We're the last country in the European Union to achieve this. What I'm hugely excited about is she's going to be called Jane or Linda, and we will make history on the 10th of April. And then I will be able to bring my life experience, my experience as an academic, but also these wider global and national experiences to bear in Trinity to ensure that we really are leading by example, not just in this area of gender, but more broadly in the whole area of equality, inclusion and diversity. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to the conversation in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Professor Allmeyer. And just to note, if attendees have any questions for the panelists, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll get around to asking them after the panelists have finished speaking. So now we're going to move on to Professor Linda Hogan.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and thank you to the committee for organising this really interesting and I think important session, and also to the audience for being here with us, and of course to my colleagues and friends Jane and Linda. It is, as we know, a historic race. It's also, I think, an important time when we can think about the implications of having 3 women in a race for a significant role like this, and what a provostship led by a woman would be, because all of our concepts of university leadership and provostship are entirely determined by a male model and a male imaginary in a way. And so I think one of the challenges for us, not just in this first phase of campaign, but also as one of us inhabits the provostship, is to reimagine the provostship itself. And I'll talk a little about that in a moment. But what I'd like to do is, first of all, our title is A New Vision for Trinity. And that's what I'd like to talk about. And as well as that, to give you a little insight into my own personal journey as I have articulated this new vision for Trinity. my manifesto is really centered around this concept of living our values. And this is really, I think, what we must do in Trinity and in academia generally. Among the sort of principles that structure my manifesto are that we must have a culture that nurtures and that is driven by generosity of spirit, that we must be a university that is oriented towards the global public good, and that has huge implications for equality and diversity for women around the world. And thirdly, that we must be a university that's driven by ethical leadership, that acts through an ethical lens, and that promotes true equality and diversity. So those really, I think, have to be and will be the engine for my vision for Trinity in the next 10 years. I have entered, as people will know, I'm a scholar of religion and ethicist. So I entered a very male-dominated field, and all along the way on my academic journey have had very important mentors and supporters. But as a student, I had no female role models at all, actually. And so one of the things that I think is really important as we think about the next decade is to ensure that we not only have female role models across academia, but also in leadership. I have spent almost a decade at the University of Leeds in the UK and was very influential and co-founder of the Centre for Gender and Women's Studies there. My research has been focused actually on issues of gender equality, feminism in the study of religion and ethics. And a lot of the work that I've done in my academic career has been focused on addressing inequities, really trying to break the mold in terms of our concepts of within the subjects we work on, and also then map a way for greater inclusion and equality, not only in the practice of academia, but in terms of those subjects that we consider important and meaningful and areas that students choose to study. So for me, there is a very direct connection between the framing of the subjects and also the valuing of women's voices in academia. As people will know, and as has been noted at the outset, I was also Vice Provost, Chief Academic Officer and Deputy President for 5 years in Trinity, and that was hugely challenging and hugely rewarding. There are many milestones. It was a very difficult time in the university's history in terms of the recession we were facing. But I think in that context, we did make very significant progress. I was very proud to support the creation of the Centre for Women's Leadership in Trinity. Eileen Drew was one of the key drivers of that through the previous decade, and also the introduction of Athena Swan, which, although has its limitations in terms of its being an overly bureaucratized process, I think what we see through the implementation of Athena Swan is where the hidden and embedded inequities are, and the obligation we have to address those inequities. So as I think about the next 10 years and many of the issues that we must address, I think the first thing that the next provost must be is a leader for cultural change. And that means not only developing robust policies and ensuring that they're implemented, but also changing the nature of the conversation we have about equality. We must create the conditions for success and must understand that there is not a trade-off between excellence and equality. They are two sides of the same coin. And so as I think about the practical ways in which we can address issues in terms of developing the equality for women and also other marginalized groups, we need to address the issue of dropout rates in among PhD students and why that, and understand the reasons for that. We must absolutely address the gender pay gap. And one of the things that I saw as Vice Provost was that where a person comes in on the scale, and also what the way in which their first years of academia are supported really does determine to a significant degree the course of their academic career. And so really having meaningful equal practices at the early stages is absolutely essential. Addressing the gender pay gap, as we know, actually is about transparency, about information that people have so that they can know what to ask for, what to expect, rather than being, rather than taking what's offered. And so there's a great deal about the power of information that I think really needs to be embedded in our practices as we're ensuring equality. Addressing precarious work, and in my manifesto I make very clear that I will develop a framework where we can have fair, equitable, stable work for all those who are employed in the university, whether they are on adjunct or part-time or full-time contracts. And that for me is a matter of equity and justice, and it is one of the first things that I would do as Provost. We have become much better at mentorship, but I think, you know, we're really only scratching the surface there. And again, meaningful mentoring practices and enduring supports for early career and mid-career researchers is, I think, absolutely essential. And also childcare. In my manifesto, I make a commitment to having a meaningful exploration and a plan for developing affordable childcare for our staff and students, because I see that that is a real serious deficit in the university.
Sorry to interrupt you, Professor Hogan. We're just coming up to time.
Okay. Final point, if I may, and that is about bullying and harassment. In my manifesto, I also map out a very specific proposal about addressing bullying and harassment in our university. We must take this seriously, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of racism and many forms of harassment that individuals face. So let me just end then, Joanne, if I can say that I think this current conversation is one that we absolutely need to have. We should not assume that because we have a woman in the provost role, things will be different. We must have, and I know that, you know, this is true for all of my, for Jane and Linda, we must have a woman provost who's committed to equality. So symbols are important, but actually what really matters is a commitment to an ethical approach to equality and diversity in the university. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hogan, and thank you to all the provost candidates. We're now going to move on to the questions that have been coming in from the attendees. I'm going to start with one that we have here that was pre-asked before the event. So it's the response to the pandemic hasn't severely impacted the work and work-life balance of staff with caring responsibilities. How will you redress this if you are provost? And I'd like to pose the question to all the attendees, beginning with Professor Linda Doyle.
So it's absolutely true, Joanne, that it has hugely affected people. And we even see, and I'm sure your group will have seen this, that a lot of the stats are showing that there's way less women, for example, submitting for publication now, and there's a significant drop off on it. And one of the things that is, I suppose, that I think is really important, and I mentioned it briefly in the opening words, is that I think the real key thing here is that the effect is disproportionate to people, women or carers, and that it's long term. And one of the things I feel is that, like, we're going to, in a few years' time, still have some of these impacts. I say the same for students. Can you imagine now students who are coming in from secondary school who don't have, you know, certain parts of the course taken? And I think we're going to see the impact in the system for a long time to come. So I think there's a mixture of kind of more informal local level things and systematic things that have to happen. In my own school in computer science and statistics in Trinity, we have been collectively looking at ways to address kind of the current work-life balance issues. But from a systematic point of view, I think there needs to be much considered. So they would fall under different headings for me. Partly in my manifesto, I'm looking at a much fairer promotion system that in the first place recognises the wider value of contributions people make, whether that's in different teaching, different research, different roles in the university, that system is designed in a way that can take maternity and paternity leave into account much more effectively than we currently do, but that also will be able to take account of the disruptions that exist. From a research perspective, before I had to step down as Dean of Research, we did do a lot of work with the government on raising money for the sector. So I successfully, together with colleagues across the sector, I led the charge to raise 48 million for research that's disrupted by COVID. And we have certain schemes in play in the universities now to allow, now that's a drop in the ocean and helps a little bit. And I can imagine more of that is going to happen in the future as well. And I think, you know, so there's structural things like that I think are really important. But ultimately, I think if there's a greater focus on work-life balance that's needed for every member of the university, that this ultimately will help everybody and allow us to kind of keep this in mind. So they're just some examples. I'm happy to discuss more. Joanne, I think.
Sorry, I was muted. Professor Linda Doyle, thank you. And now we'll move on to Professor Jane Allmeyer.
I'm very conscious of time and you wanting to get through things, so I don't want to repeat what's said, but I think it's very important to note that the pandemic has has had gender implications. In other words, women have been more adverse. Everybody's been impacted, but I think it's very clear that the data and research is showing that women have been disproportionately impacted. And so we need to really take account and compensate for that. And I think it's critical that we do that. And we do that at every possible way, both in the structures, in terms of the context of the Irish Research Council. We can pause, we should be lobbying Europe to pause. So nobody is being adversely affected by what's happened. And then within Trinity, of course, we need to be doing the same. And that needs to be reflected in absolutely everything that we're doing. The IRC was the first council actually to go put its hand up and say, we will fund costed extensions, but I think that wider initiative has been very important. However, it may need to be pushed out more. I think we also need to think about publications. Women, it's been much harder for them to publish. We've seen that drop. How can we support that? I'm extremely concerned for our early career researchers. I think they're the ones that are particularly vulnerable, as our colleagues with young children at home, or schooling children at home at the moment is a nightmare. And we need to be listening to what makes a difference to them and then acting accordingly. And I think here the university can lead and do an awful lot more than we're currently doing. And I, again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the details, Joanne, because I think we want to get through as many questions as possible. But just to be really clear, as far as I'm concerned, the pandemic must not impact adversely on anybody who, on the grounds of gender. And that's also men who have these responsibilities, caring responsibilities, and they come at both ends, childcare, but also with older parents. So I don't think we've fully actually taken account of the impact and trauma of the pandemic yet. It's a work in progress.
Thank you. And Professor Hogan, please.
Yes, thank you. And let me just add some points to this. It's very clear that the pandemic has actually amplified existing inequalities. It hasn't really, it's not so much that it's created new inequalities, it's actually really exaggerated and amplified the existing inequalities. And that's why I think the issue of the impact on women and underrepresented minorities is so important. We have to, so the response has to be systemic, I think, because it has to really accentuate the fact that there has been such a disparity in terms of impacts, and it has to redress that. There, you know, redress is really the only way we can actually, in the end, really deal with systemic and embedded inequalities. And so we need to do it by addressing the inequities in workload that are clearly across the system. We have to do it by having, as others have said, a meaningful work-life balance. We should be thinking about initiatives like Stop the Clock on a whole range of things, you know, like tenure track process, etc., so that people are not disadvantaged by where they happen to come in their career, because it's clear that for early career researchers, for those on tenure track, or for those who are working within specific timeframes, this 2-year period could have detrimental impacts. So my view is that the response must be systemic, it must be well organized, and it must target those that are most seriously impacted. The final thing I would want to say is that we must also, as we're addressing this pandemic, ensure that well-being and psychological well-being is also at the forefront here. It's not just about performance, it's about, you know, the totality of one's life experience. And that also is a responsibility of the university as a workplace.
Thank you, Professor Hogan. And we do have a number of questions to get through, and we've about 15 minutes left. So hopefully we'll get through as many of your questions as we can. And Anna is going to ask our next question to the panelists.
Yes, so we have one more question that was submitted before the event. It's a two-part question. One, do you support workers' rights for PhD students? And second, how would you leverage equality, diversity, and inclusion and combat discrimination such as racism and homophobia on campus? Professor Linda Doyle.
Are we answering in the same order each time?
Yes, sorry, that was not clear.
No problem. In other things, we've been kind of reversing orders to give, so we've all gotten into a particular expectation of how things flow. So to answer your question, I support the idea that we need to be much better at providing contractual certainty and obligations to PhD students, where there's clarity around the expectations of them and there's clarity around the expectations of the advisors and supervisors. And there are an awful lot of things in the system at the moment that mean we have various different classes of PhD students, ones who are well funded, ones who aren't funded at all, ones who work morning, noon and night, ones who have to do extra work and don't get paid for it, ones who do extra work and get paid for it. So to me, there's a multitude of kind of levels of citizens. I go beyond first, second, third class citizens in the PhD system at the moment. And I certainly think we need to dig deep into that and create some kind of contractual structures that helps with this. So that's the first thing I would say. I veer away a little bit from the workers' rights piece, because the minute you turn somebody into an employee, it means that the cost of that individual is much more. And the research system as it isn't actually even currently adequately funding students. So if we look at what's happening currently, we have many people on very, very poor stipends who certainly in Dublin and in many places in Ireland can't afford to live a very, very stressful, anxious situation. And while work has been done to increase the stipends, they're still nowhere near what's needed. And if we turn these into a situation where we go to workers' rights and they become employees, you add an additional 30% cost onto that. So if we want to do that and greatly reduce the number of people we can support, that's one thing. But at the moment, I would be much more interested in kind of a strong contractual obligation that's outside of that kind of employee type situation, and still working to improve stipend situation so that people can actually live in much better conditions. And certainly part of, I think, the engagement going forward for me, and the standing up for Trinity and standing up for the sector more broadly with the government on the research landscape very much includes wider support for researchers from all disciplines, more consistent support and better support. So that's kind of how I look at those two things, I have to say.
Thank you very much, Professor Allmeyer.
Thank you, Anna. So I just think it's very important that the first thing we need when it comes to any sort of improved conditions for early career researchers is that we agree that at a national level. And we do this working with the various agencies, HEA, THEA, IUA, and have nationally agreed minimum stipends, salaries, conditions, because I actually think what's missing at the moment is that national framework, that national minimum. And if we had had that, we would have been able to actually have increased stipends long before we did. The IRC increased ours at the same level as SFI back in January. So that was the first point that I make. Within Trinity then, I think we need much greater fairness, much greater transparency. There are tiers of citizenship. It's not just right. I think the ongoing or the review that's beginning in Trinity, being led by the Dean of Graduate Studies, is a very important moment to address some of these inconsistencies, these inequalities that currently exist in the system. In terms of contracts, we've got, we don't want to get ourselves into a guddle here, but I do think there needs to be some sort of temporary contracts that can be issued so teaching assistants actually appreciate how many hours they're teaching for, what they're going to be paid, but it protects both the department and the researcher, but it has to be done in a way that it's not attracting all of these additional costs. In terms of racism and homophobia in the university, the second part of your question, I have absolutely zero tolerance for any sort of inappropriate behavior, whether it's bullying, racism, homophobia. I mean, and we need to call it out, and then we need to do something about it. And I say this as somebody, I published an op-ed in the Irish Times recently about Ireland and the legacy of imperialism. And I was trolled, I mean, in a very, very toxic way by these anonymous, and it wasn't just that they were white supremacists, clearly, and right-wing nationalists, but they were also misogynists. Obviously, Jane, I'm a woman, but I was born in Africa, and I don't know what they thought I was, but that clearly there was a lot of racism there as well. But my name, Olmeyer, others clearly thought I was Jewish, so it brought out all the anti-Semites as well. I mean, it's a dreadful experience. And I'm a senior academic, so I'm telling you how people who are not a sort of, you know, it's not for the faint-hearted, let's put it that way. So I think when we want to deal with these issues, we need to be dealing with them, both if you want in person, but also thinking about creating an online environment where academic freedom isn't being challenged and compromised by this absolutely appalling behavior. And I think Trinity, we've got many policies in place. What we lack is we don't implement them, this implementation deficit. So I really feel very, very strongly that we need to address these issues in a very, very systematic way indeed. So thank you, Anna, for the question.
Thank you very much, Professor Allmeyer. Professor Hogan.
Thank you very much, Anna. So in relation to the first question, I would agree that we must have a national understanding, national framework and an understanding and a baseline of what is the acceptable conditions and the minimum thresholds for all PhD students. I think because there are so many different contexts in which PhDs work and the different conditions, having that national framework and having it implemented would be the first step. I too am uncertain about workers' rights, but I think one doesn't need to have workers' rights in order to have rights that are secured and that are at a sufficiently high level that we show that we respect PhD student work, that PhDs are not exploited, that they have the capacity to say no to certain things, and that they have the voice to have a meaningful presence in a department or a school, and also pursue their research. So there are power issues there, I think, that really also need to be addressed when we're looking at the issues of PhD workers' rights. I think PhDs absolutely must have rights, and must have the conditions in which they can secure those and ensure that they are protected. On the issue of racism and bullying and harassment and homophobia and misogyny, in a way it is linked to the conditions under which we create a fair and inclusive society and academy for PhD students as well. You know, we absolutely, Trinity and all universities should be bullying and harassment free zones, and we should be living our values in terms of promoting equality and dignity and respect. I lay out what I think are kind of the basics of what we must achieve and what I will be implementing if I'm provost. And the first is we must be able to investigate behavior as well as complaints. The current system we have leaves it to complainants only to take up the university's responsibility in terms of driving a culture of inclusion and knows zero tolerance in terms of bullying and harassment. That must change. The university must investigate behavior. We must also have adopt the best practice that we find in Australia and other parts of the world, where there are confidential registers, where there are panels of reviews, and where there is really meaningful penalties, meaningful investigations and meaningful penalties, where bullying takes place, where racist behavior takes place, where homophobic practice and behavior takes place. And then finally, I would say it's also about the kind of environment we create in which we set the highest standards for ourselves in terms of our language, in terms of our leadership, in terms of the culture that we create. And that is, in my mind, all about leadership in the first instance, and a leadership across the board, distributed leadership, leadership for inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your thoughtful responses to those questions. There was a lot in there and I really appreciate that. We're going to rotate for the next round of questions. We'll go first for this one to Professor Allmeyer, then to Professor Hogan, and then back to Professor Doyle. The next question is, currently being a researcher is quite precarious in Trinity. It is often difficult for a postdoc to get funding. And without a PI trying to get project funding, your contract can end and there's no possibility of continuing in research. Do you have any plans for creating a pathway to enable research careers in Trinity?
Thank you. Again, an important question. Are you guys trying to finish at 11 or are we going beyond it? Because we can have a short answer or we can have a long answer, Kathy. So maybe I'll assume we're still trying to finish at 11, so I'll answer that briefly, but I could have a much longer version. So we'll focus on the first thing is we need to be doing is creating additional opportunities for our early career researchers. And again, this is where I've been working for the last 5 years as chair of the Irish Research Council to ensure there are additional opportunities out there, not just for early career researchers in Trinity, but across Ireland. And I'm absolutely delighted that our budget was increased by 20%, and we are now about to launch a whole new round of laureate awards. And I think we need to do that constantly, advocating for additional research at the national level, which of course then makes our own researchers even more competitive in drawing down European funding, which then gives them that first ladder in order to achieve a sort of, if you want, a more stable academic career. The second thing I would say is IRC and SFI are getting together to actually create a scheme that is very much aimed at people who need to be supported in that regard. The third thing I would say is, again, we need to be thinking about wider career advice. In other words, some colleagues don't want to stay on and work in universities, and we need to be thinking how we prepare them better for the workplace. So again, in the Trinity Long Room Hub, we would have created as many opportunities as we could for colleagues that wanted maybe internships in enterprise. And I see Angie Butler's in the room, so she did a PhD in drama, and she's gone on now to work in Intel. So we need to be thinking very imaginatively how we work and support those sorts of initiatives. The final thing I'd like to say, again, within Trinity, I'd like to be creating additional opportunities. One of the stated goals of my manifesto is to reduce the staff-student ratio from the current 1:18 down to between 1:12 and 1:14 by the end of the decade. This will create many new opportunities for colleagues, especially early career researchers, because it's all about talent and about how we as an institution develop, nurture, value, respect, inspire colleagues across all career stages and across all disciplines. So for me, it's about creating opportunities within Trinity, and then of course how we fund that. And that's where, for me, philanthropy is hugely important. And I see philanthropy, if I'm elected, being an absolute, I mean, I'll be a philanthropic provost over the course of the next decade. So, and I could say much more, but I'll stop there, Kathy.
Thank you, Kathy. I understand that I'm next in line. So I think we have to address this in two ways. The first thing is to say, absolutely, there must be additional and new career opportunities for researchers in Trinity and in the Irish higher education sector more generally. I think in relation to the current system, we must first of all address the inequities in our current system. And then secondly, we must ensure that this never happens again, where we have people on very precarious contracts, moving from one contract to another, from full-time back to part-time, back to full-time again. That is just inequitous. It's unstrategic for the university, and it really does not take account of the great talent we have. So I commit in my manifesto to creating a framework that allows for decent, equitable, fair, stable employment for postdocs and for those on research contracts. And we must do that as a matter of urgency. And then secondly, we must make sure that we are never in this situation again, so that as we develop the new career paths for researchers, these issues of continuation, of clarity, of resourcing, and of the opportunities to apply for funding in one's own right, a lot of those things need to be addressed. It seems to me that many of the problems we have in Trinity in relation to researchers and the inequities are of our own making. They're our own rules, not national rules, or they're our own interpretations of national or EU rules. And we really must ensure that we have an encouraging and empowering approach to postgraduate and research careers, rather than the kind of punitive one that we have at the moment. So I would intend to address that in a radical way.
Kathy, I'll follow up on that. So for me, there's kind of two parts to that answer. And the first part is, it relates to the staff we do have. So there is a national research career framework. Trinity hasn't been good in taking the lead from that and applying it and putting it into action. And there are an enormous number of things that we can do to make the experience that people have while postdocs in Trinity much better. You know, there are things that are of our own making, but there's also a lack of kind of systematic, genuine support for that cohort. And in my manifesto, actually, in reforming Trinity Research Support, I see within that an entity that's particularly dedicated to supporting this cohort, both in ensuring that they, you know, be the best they can be, apply for all the things that they can, and freeing up the opportunities to apply. That's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is probably less good. If you look across the world, less than 4% of people who do PhDs end up being full-time academic faculty. And even if we can change things and employ more people, that's the reality of this system. And I think it's incumbent on us to face that reality and to make sure that we do manage expectations and also help people into the multitude of careers that they can go to in research. And I often quote this, there's a course people have to take. I think it's either an Imperial or UCL in London called A Postdoc is Not a Career. And I think it's really, really interesting that that's set up at the beginning, and it kind of sets things out for people. And it also puts expectations on us to deliver better for the time that people are there in the university. And one of the things that I think drives me particularly crazy as well, that very oftentimes we casually give people, we'll say teaching hours or other things, and create a very false expectation that that's going to lead to something more solid. And I think that honesty goes there too. So much better support for the people who are there, and much greater honesty in terms of the wider landscape where people can fit and what they can expect, and help to negotiate that landscape and move into different areas would be key for me. You're on mute, Joanna.
Yeah. Sorry again. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for the sake of time, but I want to express my sincere thanks to Professor Doyle, Professor Jane Allmeyer, and Professor Linda Hogan. There is still a lot to discuss, and hopefully we'll continue with these important conversations. But thank you all so much for taking part in this Women in Research event in celebration of International Women's Day. And I want to thank all the attendees and supporters as well for taking part in this event. I would like to share with you some of our upcoming events also.
Thank you very much.
Just very briefly, as part of our International Women's Day package of events, I'd like to invite you all to our collaboration with RCSI tomorrow at 12 p.m. With the event titled Ensuring Women's Voices Are Heard in the Media. And then on Monday at 6 p.m, we're partnering with Trinity Women graduates to host an event titled Celebrating Irish Scientists in the Global COVID Response with Professor Aoife McLysaght and Professor Maura Connolly. And very quickly, we're also running a mental health seminar series for researchers, which has been funded by the Royal Society of Chemistry, which will be starting soon. But again, thanks to the panelists, the Provost Candidates, for taking their time out of their day to join us today. And this was a very interesting conversation, and I think we all got a lot from this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great set of events ahead. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Sarah, as well, for the ISL.
No problem.
Brilliant.
Very interesting event.
You're still recording, yeah.
I'll stop recording. Yeah.